People do have a choice, though, to either join or participate in all of the networks, which I do. I participate. So I'm part of the BLK network at our organisation. I'm part of other networks like ABLE, which is our disability network. And I don't necessarily personally resonate, but actually it's about the education piece. It's about understanding. It's about listening. It's about that active allyship.
Hi, my name is Nadia Nagamutu, business psychologist, coach, speaker, and founder of Avenir Consulting, which creates organisational growth and success via inclusion and diversity. We've been discussing the benefits that diversity brings to companies' bottom line performance for decades with more and more evidence. But there are so many questions organisations still have about how to achieve it. How do you create a culture where people feel valued for their uniqueness and the qualities they bring? I believe it's crucial to the future success and sustainability of every organisation that they find the answer to this question to make sure that each employee is not only supported but also appreciated. With this podcast, I aim to get some of the key challenges to creating inclusive workplaces out in the open and start uncovering the solutions to embracing a culture that cares for everyone. I'm going to be having conversations with some of the most inspiring people in different countries and across industries who are pushing the boundaries on inclusion and diversity in the workplace, from topics such as parenting in the workplace, ethnicity, age, gender, mental health, and all things inclusion. I want to create a movement to change society through sharing life experiences and creating more empathy and connection. Why care? I believe that once we have organisations and societies that accept and value everyone for who they are, we become healthier, happier, and better in our roles both inside and outside work. Hello, and welcome to episode 16 of my Why Care podcast. My name is Nadia Nagamutu, and I am your host. And what an episode this is. I have the privilege of speaking to Marc McKenna-Coles, the Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging Strategy Lead at Spotify. Spotify has propelled itself into people's everyday life with its music platform offering live streaming and accessibility to music and podcasts wherever people go. Marc has an impressive career history working for big brands such as Disney, NatWest Group and Lloyd's of London. Together we discuss the necessity for education, learning about different diversity characteristics and the challenges that each community faces. We also discuss the concept of organisational maturity in the DEI space, offering his best practice view for those just starting out on their journey to organisations who are ready to embrace intersectionality and cross-pollination of affinity groups. Without doubt, Marc's definition of active allyship is one of the key takeaways. How can we create active allyship, and what is everyone's role? Marc has fantastic examples of people role modelling inclusive behaviours and some great advice for organisations wanting to do more in the DEI space. Enjoy. Marc, a huge welcome to the Why Care podcast show. I'm so happy to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for inviting me along. It's a real pleasure and a real privilege.
I have to say, I'm very much enjoying, I know people can't see this, but you've got an incredible background where you're sitting there with some brilliant rainbow Disney characters I can see.
Yeah, so my office in my home is my Disney sanctuary.
I love it.
So I kind of got a whole essence of that. So I kind of lock everything in here and it's just kind of nice to have everything around. So yeah, it's good.
Well, I would love to talk to you about, obviously, your career, all things diversity, inclusion, belonging. So maybe just as a starter, you could just tell us a little bit about your career path, your journey. How did you end up working in this space?
Wow. So my career path has been quite all over the place, really, but actually it's been very exciting. So I have a theatre degree.
Really? Oh, my goodness.
Which I studied at Middlesex University many years ago.
What sort of theatre?
Basically, it was acting and also backstage work as well. So it was a mix of both technical, set design, various other things. It was a really good course because it gave you an aspect of all rather than just be the acting element. So that was really good. I did that in Golders Green. Middlesex University used to own a small location at the top of the hill in Golders Green. So we did our degree there, but it was very exciting. I worked for Disney for 10 years. That's probably why my office is in its essence of a Disney way. Disney stores here in the UK and in the US. I also worked for Disney Cruise Line as well. And then I moved into banking. And then I discovered the employee networks. And that kind of triggered something that was always there about sort of the work around diversity and inclusion and belonging. I actually managed to land a role for a short period of time to manage the gender network for RBS NatWest at the time. It was actually a role. It wasn't a volunteer role. It was an actual paid role in the job.
That's quite unusual, isn't it?
It is, because the gender network was so vast globally. They wanted to make sure that they had someone that could help oversee all of the activity, what was going on, et cetera, et cetera. So the sponsor was very keen to bring that in. But then unfortunately, the sponsor left the organisation, which meant that that role kind of had to change. But I was then given an opportunity to then land a role in the newly developed diversity and inclusion team at RBS. So my then boss that I then worked with in that team basically took a stab. I had no real experience. I'd done the work in the gender network. I had a passion for it, all of those sort of things. And I'm extremely grateful. And I did nearly 4 years in that team. I then went to Lloyd's of London, which I was at for 2.5 years, looking at diversity and inclusion, not only for Lloyd's of London, but across the insurance market, and leading on their diversity and inclusion festival. And then 6 months ago, I joined Spotify.
Yeah, congratulations.
I wanted to start thinking about different industries, moving away from financial services. And this opportunity sort of came to me rather than me go to them, which was great. And it's so different, but really good.
So you wanted something different in terms of industry. What really attracted you to, was there something about the brand of Spotify? Was it something about the industry that you just wanted to get to understand this very sort of niche industry, new industry, in fact, isn't it?
Yeah, so Spotify sort of class themselves in the sort of audio industry. So you'll never find that on a loan application, by the way. So if what industry do you work in? Audio. No, it's not there. Any people that do loan applications, make sure you add that in as a new industry. What attracted me? I think there was twofold, that it has huge reach and influence to a consumer, but also it has a very diverse population base within its own organisation. For me, it was about, okay, what can I do? What lens, what influence can I bring to all of that? I enjoy the customer-facing element of it. My role is not necessarily that too much, but I do have influence into that. The business areas I work with support the consumer. So, any changes that I'm trying to make internally will always have a knock-on effect to the consumer in the future. So I think very much it's got that sort of encapsulation of many elements that I kind of enjoy working on. And the fact that, yes, it is it's a very new brand. It's 15 years old and it's fantastic. And the people that I work with, my boss, the team, the wider sort of populations that I have communication contact with on a regular basis are all fantastic. And they all want to do great stuff. And so they also want to keep learning. And part of my role is not only about influencing change, it's around education. And it always has been. So it gives me the opportunity to help and support that education stream as well.
What specifically do you feel that your role, how does it involve education?
So giving people insight into global inequalities, and this is no one's fault, but, some countries don't necessarily have a global view on certain inequalities. Let's take the LGBTQI plus community. Some countries, like the UK, it's not the best, but we've got it good here. But then the language primarily on social media of why don't we have straight pride? We always have gay pride. In the UK, the gay community or the lesbian or the trans community have all got it good. Well, they haven't. They haven't. Some of the communities, even in the UK, haven't got it good. The trans community, the non-binary, gender non-conforming, gender fluid, all are blasted constantly in the press or on social media. But then we go wider into the global aspect, and there are still 10 or 11 countries where the death penalty is still in place for homosexuality. Pride can look like a party on a street, but actually there is real true meaning in there about we need to claim our space. We need to show that we are human beings that are able to achieve. Tom Daley, for example, who recently won gold alongside his diving partner and also then bronze in the individual, his speech around winning gold, speaking about the fact of being a gay man, and for years he felt that he wasn't able to achieve because maybe society wouldn't be able to accept. And there was criticism of that speech. Why does he have to talk about being gay? And someone eloquently put on social media as I've just described, there are 10, 11 countries where there's still the death penalty, and some of those countries participate in the Olympics. So to voice that is really important. And race as well. Race can be a very different picture across the world. We talk about Black Lives Matter movement, which is absolutely so important, but that can mean very different things in different parts of the world. It's not the same as it would be in both the US and the UK. It can be something very different in parts of Europe. And also if we move into sort of Asia, it can mean something very, very different. Not that inequalities don't exist. It's just a very different conversation to have.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of reading around this subject, around how racism plays out in countries like in Asia and sort of the countries where people might think, well, actually, from a visible perspective, there isn't as much diversity. And yet there is, and there's a number of different ethnicities and races within each Asian country. And there's hierarchy between them. And I find it fascinating. I'm still learning. And so that education is so important for me. But something else resonated with me around what you were saying. And so I was talking to a good friend of mine. Her organisation is doing a lot of work in this space at the moment in diversity, inclusion and belonging. And she said, I don't understand why we have to have groups of people, these networks that have now popped up in my organisation. I think she was referring to employee resource groups. There isn't one for straight white men. So why are we boxing people? Can't we just treat people with respect? And why do we have to have different groups of people and categorize in that way? So what's your response to that?
So I kind of partly get the query behind that. However, networks have a huge part to play in an organization. And I refer back to the education piece that I spoke about earlier on. They have a part to play around sort of educating, supporting, being visible, being a voice from the grassroots all the way up as well. But yes, sometimes by having these separate categories, it does feel like you're boxing people up. People do have a choice, though, to either join or participate in all of the networks, which I do. I participate. So I'm part of the BLK network at our organisation. I'm part of other networks like ABLE, which is our disability network. And I don't necessarily personally resonate, but actually it's about the education piece. It's about understanding. It's about listening. It's about that active allyship. And it also depends on the maturity of your organisation. So for some organisations that are in their sort of starting block, having those sort of separate groups helps kind of bring alive those topics, bring alive those particular demographics of individuals. What some organisations have started to do and have gone down that maturity line is they've started to think, do you know what? We are more mature. We are having those conversations. But what we now need to do is to start thinking more about that intersectionality. Now, intersectionality is a word that's been bandied around for quite some time. I get very nervous about the word. I love it, but I get nervous. And I get nervous because some organisations try and use it and they are not ready to use it. They haven't yet established themselves on how are they going to support that broader conversation. They kind of just go, right, we're just going to create intersectionality. And I think you've got to have a sense of maturity when you start talking about it, because when you start talking about that people have multiple layers about themselves and you start saying, well, the white straight individual, well, the white straight individual, for example, is not necessarily just that. They are made up of various other things. They might have parental responsibilities. They might have a disability of some sort or a family member or et cetera, et cetera. So that creates that more layered approach. But I think organizations need to be ready to have those conversations. They need to prepare themselves. And I know that some organizations have disbanded separate networks because they're already on that maturity level and they've kind of created this more intersectional network to help broaden that conversation across the wider scope. But I think, especially if you're in your infancy of your journey or you're still working through your journey, I think having some of that separation does have its benefits. But what you do is you start slowly moving across. So one of the things I did in my previous organization was that we had some great networks that did some great stuff. When I first started, they never really spoke to each other. So one of my key things was that every 6 weeks, the leads of each of those networks would all come together with me and we would all talk about what's going on in their networks. And within the second meeting, everyone was going, oh, I've got the same issue as you. I've got the same issue as you. Or actually, we could do this. We could do this. And what you start doing is you start bringing together some of those things, working together as network. You start developing in the early stages a form of intersectionality without absolutely banding it as intersectionality.
And so then what happens with that conversation? I'm really interested in that, because for me, this concept of maturity through the diversity, inclusion, belonging organisational journey is really fascinating. So what we're saying is that those who are starting out, that separation and creating these networks where women can come together or people of an LGBTQ plus community can come together is important. But later on, and I suppose you only know a point where that's working and it's working well and people are talking in those networks, then what I'm hearing is those networks start coming together, maybe just from the chair people or those people who lead them coming together, sharing. How do you create the intersectionality conversation?
I think it's the bringing together of those networks and the networks starting to cross-pollinate some of the work that they do. Thinking about how is the makeup of your organisation looking? Are you getting a viewpoint of good representation? Where organisations still lack in data, you still need to build that representation. So I think people's maturity level about intersectionality can also depend on what data you have on those people to make an informed choice to see whether you've actually got a good mix of people to start bringing together those sort of conversations as well. And we know many organizations out there still suffer with data. It could be through history, it could be through legal aspects in certain countries, societal things that keep coming in as well, which that's one of the things that is one of my bugbears. I really get annoyed when people say to me, oh, but we can't collect data in that country. And I'm like, why? What has the legal team said? And they said, oh, no. Society has said that we can't. And I'm like, no. I'm sorry.
Hang on a second.
Let's move on from that. What society says and what the law says is two different things. We can change a mindset of societal as long as we communicate it, we talk about it in a more positive way, and that we're secure about the data we handle. Yes, I get there are laws in certain countries, but we need to respect those laws, but also follow those laws. And actually, if the law does say to us, we can collect that data, let's go and do it. And data is important. It's not the only thing, because actually you should be respectful of everyone, irrespective of data, but that will give you a bigger insight, and it may start helping you develop how you start cross-pollinating, creating that intersectional sort of elements of conversation as well.
That's fascinating. I do actually have a client at the moment who's struggling with the data aspect and saying, we can't force people, right? We can ask the question, but actually just looked at who's answered. Because basically one of the things that I'm doing is wanting to understand what's their demographics look like. What do you have in terms of gender split? What do you have in terms of ethnicity split? What do you have in terms so that we can understand the diversity of their organisation? And it turns out that they don't understand the diversity of their organisation because that data was never collected and people didn't volunteer it. And so there's something there around trust, isn't there? Trust about what the organisation is going to do with that data and information.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I learned when I was at RBS was a great thing. We started to improve how we asked people's information, primarily in the UK, because that was our biggest employee base at the time. But we started to expand that. And what we started to do was to understand some of the engagement through how people disclose. So, for example, we saw a low disclosure in the disability categories. And we knew through various other conversations, the network and other, that there was a higher proportion of people with disabilities. So what we started to do is to develop the conversation around disability. And we started to develop how we should talk about that and the true essence of disability and all the different support mechanisms that the organisation wants to try and do to help people with disabilities. What started to happen? People started to disclose their disability a lot more because they felt that if they could do that, it would help the organisation even further to move the dial in the space around disability. And that was the same around ethnicity. That was the same around sexual orientation and even parents and caring responsibilities as well. So sometimes you have to kind of be showing up that you want to do stuff, not just send a message out and say, we want your information. You've got to prove that you're doing it for the right reasons as well.
I really like that. That's a brilliant example of transparency. This is just me looking at Spotify's website and seeing all of the diversity, inclusion, belonging statistics. It's very transparent in where the organisation's at with regards to sort of the ratio, gender and ethnicity. So I love that. I think that, why not? That seems to me important for Spotify's brand and an organisational brand to be that transparent. But what do you think the benefits are really of that transparency for organisations?
We are a customer-facing organisation. So we also want to be reflective of our consumers. If we talk about our gender data, and if you go to our life@spotify.com web pages, you can see the current data that we hold around gender. And our gender representation is good. As with all organisations, we want to be better. So we don't just only ask female and male on our system. We also ask about non-binary as well. So we're trying to be as inclusive, and we have some disclosure around that. And that's all on the website as well. You can see that there's a slight mention.
It's the first time I've seen a percentage in that, rather than it being binary male and female in terms of statistics, that first time I've seen the category non-binary displayed in that way.
Yeah, but that comes with time as well, because evidently, and some work that I did when I was at Lloyd's of London, I worked with a fantastic organisation called Global Butterflies, and we pulled together an amazing guide, which is around trans non-binary inclusion. And in there's some great stats in there that talk about that in the next decade or so, around 20% of the younger generation will not identify with a binary gender. So we as organisations, be it the organisation I currently work for or organisations I've worked for before or organisations that are out there, need to think about that. Now, we know that there are some unfortunate pit stops, be it the government. HMRC, for example, the things I get all the time from organisations when they hear organisations like myself and one that I worked with previously, well, it's great that you're asking this non-binary option, but what about HMRC? How are you declaring that information? Well, there are always ways around that. For example, when I worked at Lloyd's of London, if someone identified as non-binary on our HR system, we had a message that came up that said, due to some third parties, we do require a binary gender. So please contact HR and have that discussion.
Yes.
You know, we are not disrespecting your gender identity on our systems, but unfortunately, there are other organisations that are not disrespectful, that just haven't moved with the times yet.
Okay.
So we have to understand from their point of view, what binary gender do we need to just put down for you for those particular purposes? Now, as soon as HMRC, pension providers, et cetera, start changing with the times, then absolutely. And there's an amazing person out there who is currently taking the government to court around having a third gender option on passports, which many other countries are starting to develop. We're starting to see that. The US have now just recently announced that they are going to start implementing that on ID as well. And actually, I watched the UK court case live on a live stream, and it was very interesting just to listen to some of the sort of arguments for and against. I have to be very measured, but sometimes I don't always agree with the against arguments. I'm very much for it. People need to respect that gender identity, which has been around for centuries, outside of the binary I'm talking about here. It's been around for centuries. You can find books, you can find writings that talk about trans and non-binary people from centuries ago. But it was never really spoken about because it tended to be from the classes that were more educated because they had the ability to talk about those sort of things. But it's been around. It's not a new thing. And we've got to remember that. So all of those different aspects as well is really, really important to sort of move the dial. So I think organizations do need to think about, they've got to be future ready. If they want to attract that new talent, they've got to be future ready. But also if they want to attract existing talent that may be very comfortable in their current organization, but do want to move on for many different reasons, and they may identify in a particular way, be it through gender, race, disability, or whatever, they want to make sure that they're going to a new organization that is respectful of that.
Absolutely. And I love that the concept that actually the organization has the power. The organization can ask the question. It doesn't mean that you have to wait for the whole of society, the government, everyone to be ready for that question and the answer. But as an organization, each organization has the power to ask that question and then do something with the response in order to help tick the necessary box in whatever necessary process and system outside of their control. So that makes complete sense to me. You said in terms of ERGs, you belong to pretty much all of them, even though actually you may not identify with being disabled. We have had a very short conversation around allyship before, and I'm interested just to go in a little bit deeper, because to me, I see different forms of allyship. On LinkedIn, for example, there's lots of likings of posts with respect to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, articles or comments. So that is a form of allyship, right? If you're supporting someone else in their view. But that sort of seems to be the lower end of the scale in terms of demonstrating allyship, and it can manifest in many different forms. What's your view when people say that they're allies? What does that mean? What's your definition of it?
I think there are two definitions of allies. So there are allies and then there's active allyship. The sort of general broad sense of allies are very much people that want to maybe be educated. They want to understand a bit more about a particular community or topic. They might sort of show up at an event. They might do something. But what they won't do is that they won't put their head above the parapet. They'll just stay below, let's say, the waterline. They'll just understand or start educating themselves about that. And I think, or they'll put something on their desk that shows that they are respectful in a particular way or something like that. Then we move into that active allyship level. And that's those people that speak up. Those are the people that want to take action and support that particular community. Now, on my profiles on social media, I talk about being a trans ally. And I think as a gay man, I feel that it's right that I should be part of, I have a passion for it. I have a lot of friends who are part of the trans community, but I also think that I've wanted to learn. I had some insecurities around gender identity in the past. I didn't understand why someone identified in a particular way or why that things changed for them. And I didn't understand that. And now I now understand a huge amounts more. I don't think I understand it all because I'm not a trans person myself. I'm a cisgender male, but I don't ever speak on behalf of the trans community. So I'm not going to bleat on about that. What I will do is I'll speak alongside the trans community. So when I see inequalities, I want to speak alongside. And a great example of a brilliant active ally, there's a gentleman out there called Stephen Wardlaw, and he is the chairman of Emerald Life, which is an insurance company.
Okay.
He's a great guy. Met him several times. Fantastic. And there's a huge amount of bashing in the press at the moment around Stonewall, around the trans community, around LGBT community as well. And he is sometimes on a daily basis, sometimes on a weekly basis, going and he's finding these articles primarily from some of the broadsheets. And he's going through the articles and questioning everything that's being said and publishing his questions that are being said. And it's brilliant because what it's doing, it's highlighting that there is inaccuracies in what the press and the media are talking about. And he's highlighting that. And what that's doing, he's standing alongside that community and saying, this is what I'm seeing, this is wrong, things need to change, and the press need to realize that. And I see that from people when we think about Black Lives Matter. We see a lot of people that identify as non-Black or from other communities that were really sort of trying to educate themselves to understand those inequalities, because we all need to understand that inequalities exist. What we want to also understand is that inequalities can disappear if we do the right thing.
So how critical is active allyship to combating these inequalities?
Huge. I think it's massive. I think it's a way of people really bringing strong voices to the front of everything. We think about in the disability space, for example, the disability space is a massive, complex spectrum. And we've got Caroline Casey out there who's built the Valuable 500. And this is very much around CEOs really putting themselves forward about that. Now, Caroline Casey is very open about her own disabilities, but very much so what she has created is this community of active allies that really want to move the dial in the disability space, hugely want to move the dial in the disability space, because It's something that people don't speak about, but we know that over 70% of individuals will acquire some form of disability during their working life. So actually, why is it something that's right on the back burner? And actually bringing people in to really sort of talk about it, that active allyship around the spectrum of disability. And we know that, in the UK, under the Equality Act, disability is protected and there's certain elements of that, but that can look very different in other countries as well. So people also need to educate what does the meaning of disability mean in various locations, but actually it's about the support mechanism. I heard a great podcast the other week where it was a guy who unfortunately drew through a trampolining accident, has ended up being in a wheelchair. Now, at the start of his time in the wheelchair, he felt that as something that was just awful in his life. But actually, it's part of who he is now. And it's the surroundings around him that create the disability. So if he can't get his wheelchair into a location, that's not his disability stopping him. That's the surrounding stopping him. And it's the importance of active allyship to recognise things like the accessibility into buildings, the surroundings, the height of certain things. And a good example of a bank that developed some iPad tables when iPads were becoming a big thing for banks to have in their banking hall. And they developed this iPad table and they wanted it so that kids couldn't get to the iPads, understandably.
Right.
So they made it to a height that adults could reach. Funny that, but you could wheel a wheelchair underneath it. So actually, the thought process behind it was, we're trying to address it for one thing, but actually, are we thinking about the bigger picture?
Yes.
That has since changed. Banks are really good in that space around the disability stance, that they have different levels that people can go to. And so all of those different things are when people kind of put what I call that inclusion speed bump in when they are thinking about those things. And it's those active allies that really create that conversation as well.
I love that. And it just reminded me of going out in a zoo over the weekend, and we were in the toilets there with my daughter, and the sink was that little bit lower, and she just walked up to it and used it, as opposed to me having to sort of help her. And usually I'll have to sort of get the soap in my hand and put it in her hand because she can't reach the soap dispenser, but there was one at her level. And so I know that we're talking disability here, obviously, but it was so empowering, or just for her to have that independence was so important. And so I see the world through her eyes and think of all the limitations that she has. And of course, she's a child. That's very different to someone in a wheelchair or having a disability. But in essence, the world is limited for her in a similar way from a height perspective. My friend, again, who I was speaking to, she just says, I don't get it. Can't we just treat people with respect? Why do we have to talk about allyship? What is this word allyship? If everyone just treats each other, just get on with it, then why can't we just do that? And I think you've just spoken there in terms of the answer around, well, the world isn't designed that way. We can't just crack on and get on with it. It isn't just about people's behaviour. It's about how the world's designed.
Absolutely. And I think that's also the differentiation between equality and equity. The active allyship element brings in that equity. So the great pictorial viewpoint of equality and equity is, I think there are three people trying to watch a baseball match. They're all of different heights and they're all looking over the fence. And equality would give them the same size box to stand on. But obviously the taller person, who could have seen anyway, can see. The middle-sized person can now see. And then the shorter person still can't see. But actually what you do is you give them different size boxes in relation to what requirements they need. It then gives them that equality. So equity does require that push up. And I think the active allyship is a key voice to helping out and supporting equity as well.
I feel, anyway, that we see more active allyship in certain areas in terms of diversity characteristic compared to others. So gender, for example, when it comes to women, it's a conversation we've had for a fairly long time now. And there seems to be more active allyship. There's more discussion around male allies. I don't see it as much in other communities. So do you feel that we need to be focusing on other communities or different communities more than we actually are at the moment?
Yeah, I do. And I think we then go back to the conversation we had much earlier on around that intersectionality, where people do have the ability to intersect their allyship. and actually think about the fact that if they are a ally in the gender space or an active ally in the gender space, let's think about, so if I look at senior women, especially in the financial services, and there are some amazing senior women in financial services. I've worked with some of them as well, and they are fantastic. But if we look at the ethnicity split of those senior women in financial services, it's very much like what the male population looks like. So I think what people need to recognize is that they can be an ally in the gender space to improve female representation at all levels, but also at senior level, but recognizing there may be those additional struggles for people of color, Black, Asian, other minority ethnics as well, and thinking about, okay, what is that additional thing that I can do to really take my gender allyship and move it into a new space? Start thinking about those elements as well, because, you know, the chairperson of John Lewis is a Black woman. Great. And it's highly celebrated, and quite rightly so. And they are making some huge decisions at the moment for that organisation. I would never want to be in that person's shoes. And I get that. And it's great to celebrate. But actually, sometimes you also want to start making it as normal as possible. Active allyship should end up meaning that whatever an active ally was trying to achieve becomes normal. It's normal to see people from various ethnic backgrounds, from various sexual orientations, genders, disabilities, family situations, etc., 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 in positions of authority or seniority within an organisation. So I think there are various things, and that's kind of tricky scenario. And that's why diversity and inclusion, yes, it's been around for quite some time. The conversation has been around for many, 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 many years. And it will continue to be around for many, many, many years. By the time I'm retired, that conversation will still continue. So I kind of see that I'm still I have got a role somewhere to play. But I think we are slowly eating away. You know, if we think about gender pay gap reporting in the UK, there has been some real significant changes in certain industries when it comes to how that's changing. And we've got to remember gender pay gap reporting is different from equal pay. So it is about levels. So we are starting to see level changes for female representation in organisations and industries. But there is still more to do. There is still much more to do.
That vision of just it being completely normal to see someone from a minority or underrepresented group in a position of power and not celebrate it would be incredible, wouldn't it? I kind of feel we're a long way off of that, because those moments, whenever they come, are just so highly celebrated and the limelight's on them. I'd love to see the day where it's just like...
Celebrate the job that they do, not necessarily the person that they are.
Love that. I love that. So we're just coming to the end. I'd love just to hear, what is the next thing that is on the diversity, inclusion, belonging sort of horizon that you think is important for organisations to be focusing on?
So I think here in the UK, finally, if the government kind of take forward, ethnicity pay gap reporting will be coming down the line. And I think that's going to be a huge thing to really sort of emphasise on that. Now, we know that organisations have already started to report on it. Also, organisations need a fairly good disclosure rate before they can start reporting on it, because it just doesn't come across very well. So I think there's going to be a huge lens on that, and really trying to understand exactly the inequalities in amongst people from various different ethnic backgrounds. And I think it's important to realise that there are inequalities inside that group as well. So we've got to recognise it's not just don't band everyone together. Recognise the differences that can come across within those communities as well. So I think that's an important piece. And I think very much so that because it's been on the sort of, so the LGBT plus community, I think gender identity and that sort of conversation is still going on. There's still a lot more to happen. But I do think organisations are trying to move the dial there. But disability is very much probably another one that is something that organisations have kind of shied away from a little bit, have not quite been there. But I think really is becoming part of how we better entice great talent into organisations. If I think in the tech space, we know that there's going to be a high proportion of people with neurodiverse issues in the workplace. We know that the last 18 months or so or even longer, has developed conversations around mental health. All of these different facets which sit in the disability space are something that is going to be a real key part of upcoming talent that's going to come from schools and colleges where they currently sit at the moment, but also talent that's already out there but wanting to look for various different things. And if organizations can prove that they're really making real indents into those sort of topics, then actually they are going to be an organization that people are going to want to work for and do the best that they possibly can.
Wow. Well, I have to say, Spotify is incredibly lucky and fortunate to have you leading the way in diversity, inclusion, belonging, Mark. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear all of your insights and advice, and the journey you've been on is incredible. So thank you so much. If people wanted to get hold of you, are you active on social media?
I'm very much on LinkedIn and I'm on Twitter. People can probably find me on there as well.
Excellent. Well, the link to everything that Mark and I spoke about today is going to be available on the usual place in the show notes page of avenirconsultingservices.com under podcasts. So Mark, thank you so much. It's been amazing to talk to you. Look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Thank you.
That concludes episode 16 of the YCare podcast. I love Mark's concept of speaking alongside people with different diversity characteristics to our own. Active allyship, as Mark says, is key to creating equity. I'm really looking forward to hearing more from Mark and the great work that he's doing at Spotify. Do let Mark and I know what you thought of today's show. You can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter and Instagram with the handle @Nadia and @Avenir Consulting Services. As always, I really appreciate your support of this podcast through leaving a review on whatever platform you're listening and spreading the word by sharing it with your friends and family. Huge thanks to Mauro Kenji for editing this podcast and John Rice for supporting with the show notes and getting it out there on social media.